Now, here's the drama in a sense, which by the way is not drama. It's more like a misunderstanding. You have Dave Ramsey, you have George, which is basically his co-host, I think, and then you have some random guy that makes a call and makes everything happen. Now, here's your context, okay? Dave Ramsey basically says you can do basically with an 8% withdrawal rate. Everyone else in the finance world basically swears by the 4% rule, which basically means you take 4% of your portfolio and that way you don't run out of money, at least for 30 plus years, okay? Now, George basically makes a video and he says, hey, I think when you use honestmath.com or whatever, you can basically get away with like a 3% to 4% withdrawal rate.
But when we move on to the 3% withdrawal rate, you will see that even 35 years into retirement, if you withdraw 3% a year, you'll still be left with 90% of the account balance.
Now, obviously, if Dave Ramsey, the owner of the Ramsey stuff, and George that basically works there are basically saying two different things, that's a problem.
Okay, I'm a little confused because I don't know what the hell George is doing a 3% withdrawal rate, because that's absolutely wrong.
Now, on the show, when a caller basically called in and told Dave what basically George did, Dave kind of went on a rant in some way. Now, you're probably wondering, Tommy, what do you think, okay? What is your stance? What do you use, okay? Do you use the 4% rule like everyone in finance? Or do you use, for example, the 8% rule like, for example, Dave Ramsey does? And by the way, one thing I do want to say is this. Everyone likes to take stands, and I think context is so important because even the 4% person that made the rule, it's not like a fixed rule in a way. It's basically done on the Trinity study, and the whole idea is, yeah, the 4% rule, the odds are higher that you're not going to run out of money, but if you have a very slow market, you could take less money. And Dave Ramsey says, hey, the 8% is fine, but if you have a very bad market, you can take basically less. So it's not like people are set in stone with these things, although they want to paint it that way in a way, but when you really look at the context, it's so much more than that. And that's why I'm making this video to dive deep so everyone basically understands fully. Now, if you guys don't know me, my name is TommyBryson. Do me a favor and smash the like button. Now, here's the first thing I basically want to nail down here, and it's the Dave Ramsey's 8% rule. Now, the 8% rule is super important, and here's why. Dave Ramsey is basically saying this because, hey, again, the more money you can take out, the less money you need. The less money you can take out, the more money you need. Now, let's just grab a calculator real quick and basically just do some quick math here. By the way, it's not that complicated. And when I first started out investing, I used the 4% rule also. And I swore by it in a way. But as you keep growing in knowledge, you kind of get to see, hey, here's the context, here's how this works, and here's how I should be thinking these things through logically. Now, the whole idea is, let's say, for example, your goal is to get to $1 million in investing. But the reason you want $1 million is because you want a $40,000 income a year, right? Because, hey, if you're using the 4% rule, that basically tells you if you have $1 million, you multiply by 4%, well, that's going to give you $40,000. Now, do you know how long it takes someone to get to $1 million? The answer is decades. It's not a joke. It's a long time. Now, when people hear the word decades, automatically they can become unmotivated. And Dave Ramsey basically points that out in his response video. Now, if you say, for example, hey, instead of taking 4%, you can take 8%. Basically saying, instead of needing $1 million, you only need $500,000. Now, how long does it take you to get to 500K instead of $1 million? The answer is decades less, okay? Or a decade less, which is basically a lot less. It can basically motivate people to actually try to attempt this whole goal. Now, Dave Ramsey's whole 8% rule, it doesn't come from thin air. There's a logical mindset or idea behind it, which is basically if the market averages 12% a year and inflation has been 4%, well, what's 12 minus 4? The answer is 8. So you can take the 8%. Now, here is what you need to know. This is an over time return. And Dave Ramsey knows this. So that's why he said, if the market doesn't return that much, you minus a 4% and you take the profits.
If you think you can only pull off 4% off of investments making 12, where the flip is the other 8% going?
That's the idea. Now, he never actually talked about, well, what if the market is negative that year? How much do you take out then? That's another subject, and I'll talk about that later in the video because it's super important. But the whole idea is there is a logical stance behind it. If your whole concept is to just, hey, I'm not interested in actually growing my money per se, I'm interested in preserving my capital and to actually make sure inflation doesn't basically erode it, then it makes sense, right? I make 12% a year. I leave 4% for inflation. I take 8%. Basically makes sense, okay? It makes sense. However, the logic is flawed. And the flaw behind it is when it actually comes down to, hey, Tommy, you don't actually make 12% a year. Now, I'll tell you how I actually think this through myself. Now, overall, I use, for example, the 4% rule. And the reason is, I read this book a while back. It was called The Psychology of Money. And in the book, the author basically says, you want to use a financial strategy that if you end up on the other side of luck, which is basically unlucky, you don't actually get wiped out. And what that basically means that, hey, you could have a 50% success rate and a 50% you're done financially. You don't want to play those odds because, hey, if you lose everything. Now, if you're telling me, hey, if this doesn't work, I lose like a part of my capital, but I'm not wiped out, that's different. Now, I want to show you guys this table that I have over here, which is very important to this video. So here's the table I actually want to show you guys. I'll actually zoom in, so don't worry. But this is what I call a retirement portfolio success rate by withdrawal rate, portfolio composition, and payout period. As you can tell, I just read the title. But the whole idea is, this is going to show you your success rate of not running out of money depending on what percentage of your money you're actually taking out. So the idea is, if you have 100 eggs, right? And every single year you take 4 eggs and 8 eggs are put into it every year, but sometimes you don't get any eggs, what's the probability that you're actually going to run out of eggs completely? That is what this actually shows you, okay? So if you only have stocks, which by the way, I only have stocks. I only invest into the S&P 500. If I use what George called the 3% rule, I will not run out of money. There is basically 100% success rate. I'm probably not gonna run out of money unless we have a nuclear war and then there is no money. However, if I use the 4% rule, my success rate over like 30 years is about like 98%. And by the way, I do want to point something out, that when people are running these numbers, people usually think they're going to live forever, and they're probably not, okay? If you're going to be retiring at age 60 and you're averaging like, hey, this has to last me for 30 years, the answer is, if you're taking only 4%, your capital is most likely going to grow more and more and more, and you're going to have a massive nest egg after you're done, after you're dead, basically, and that's not really going to be worth it. The goal is to actually end everything with like 0 potentially, or near 0, which is very hard to do, but that's what you actually want to do. And that's where Dave Ramsey kind of comes in a way, right? So here's the idea. If you actually use the 8% rule with Dave Ramsey, you only have a 76% success rate or an 80% success rate over 25 years. Is that bad? The answer is no, if you're only doing stocks. But notice what happens the minute you say, I'm gonna do 50% stocks and 50% bonds. Well, you go from 8%, now you're like at 53%. And the idea is, hey, you're like almost 50-50. 50-50. Now, that is pretty risky if you actually ask me. And I really wouldn't want to play those games. So, does it make sense what Dave Ramsey is saying? Absolutely. However, here's the problem. Could you use Dave Ramsey's rule of 8% and just adjust every now and then? Yeah. Could you use the 4% and just adjust every now and then? Yes. And are you probably going to run out of money? The answer is probably not, but only if this is not your case. If your only life support in retirement is going to be just the stock market, that is not going to be a good idea. I think people forget that the longest stock market downfall lasted like over 20 years. So that could happen. Now, here's what happens. If you're taking 8% or 4% and we have an extended amount of basically just like downfall in the stock market, even at 4%, you're not going to be able to most likely live off that income. Because if the market drops by 25% or 40% and you had a certain amount of money in there, you're going to be screwed over. So that's why even in the Dave Ramsey plan, where he tells you, hey, just invest 15%, but once you have the mortgage paid off and you're investing into the college fund for the kids or whatever, you can feel free to just keep investing more and more money. And the whole idea is the more money you invest, the larger the cushion you actually have. Now, it's very important we understand that when Dave Ramsey says, hey, you can use an 8% rule, he's not telling this. He's not telling people this like the average person. He's telling this to basically people that are debt-free, because that's his plan. People that have a fully funded emergency account, because that's his plan. And on top of that, people that have also a paid-off mortgage potentially, right? Because that's only the time when you're actually going to consider actually retiring in a way. You see what I'm saying here? So there's a lot of room for flexibility for an individual of that nature. For example, Tommy, would you ever consider taking more than 4% of your portfolio? The answer is yes. Would you ever consider taking 8%? The answer is yes, although it is unlikely. I'm probably going to stick with like 4 to 5%, but it's unlikely I'll take that much money. But because I have no debt, because I have a fully funded emergency account, because I have like enough cash to pay off a home and basically just own it, then when you think about it, and I still have a job, which I basically earn income from, when you think about it, if I take 8% during the good years of the market, and when the market is basically down, I take 3% or I take no money, you have more flexibility. So either one works, but this does not work for the person that basically is just reliant alone to survive on the market. Because if they're using the 8% rule and all they have is exactly what they need, let's say for example, hey Tommy, I need literally, no joke, I need, let's do like a random math calculation here before I leave this video. But let's say, no joke, you want to have at least $40,000 in income. No, that's too much money, right? If you have everything like covered or whatever. Let's say you need $25,000 in income, right? Now, simple math here. If you want to get to the 25%, well, the 4% rule to find out how much money you need, just multiply this number by 25. If you want to basically figure out what the 8% rule is, just multiply it by 12.5. But literally, if you want $25,000 in income, multiply by 25 using the 4% rule, you're going to need $625,000. Divided by 2, that's what you would need using, for example, the 8% rule. It is half. It is a lot more different. Now, let's say, for example, during a bad year, the market crashes by like 30%. So all you have in there is basically, let's say, hey, I only have $18,000. Now, 8% of that is just, for example, $17,500. Obviously, you don't have enough money anymore. So you're going to have to go to work and do something to actually figure out what you're going to do. And you could run out of money faster that way. So you see, you want to have flexibility by having some source of income, by having low cost of living, and by not just depending only on the stock market. And if you do depend on the stock market, now, instead of having like $300,000, if you had $500K, then you have more room to play around if the market does go down because you have a lot of cushion. That's the idea. So no, I don't disagree with Dave Ramsey. And no, I don't disagree with the people that are all about the 4% rule. And what I do personally is I use common sense and I analyze and say, what works best for me? And I'm worried about the stock market going down like everybody else. So that's why you kind of build a life where you're not just reliant on that. For example, this year, I might take 8% or 5% of my portfolio. Why? Because I want cash to be able to buy property to actually get me some cash flow per month. But that's different because that's basically diversifying. But to live off, I would probably just do like 4 to 5%. If the market is crazy high, maybe 8%, but I want to keep my cost of living down so I wouldn't really have that need. You see what I'm saying here? But that's it, guys. Thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it helped. I'll see you guys next time, and peace. Long-term team out.